In some ways, the Punnett Square is the bread and butter of genetics. It's something that allows you to look at a potential crossbreeding between two organisms and figure out what are the most likely genetic outcomes of this breeding. And this relies on a few of the general principles that Gregor Mendel developed for genetics. There's the law of segregation, which says that if the parent has two different alleles of the same gene, it's likely that they'll only pass one of those on to their offspring, and the other parent will pass one of their alleles on. So that's segregation. And there's also the law of independent assortment, which says that if multiple genes are being passed on, there's a great likelihood that there's no connection whatsoever between one gene being passed on and a separate gene being passed on. They independently assort, and so there isn't a lot of linkage. Now, since then, we've learned a few things, and there are degrees of linkage. Some alleles are passed on with each other more than others. But at its root, the Mendel laws of genetics are very important. So we can assume that if a parent has two different alleles of the same gene, it will only pass one of those down to its offspring, and the other parent will do the same. And so we use Punnett squares a lot to look at the genetic outcomes of breeding. And here we're dealing with a question that involves only a single gene. And so we have two parents, both of which have a genotype of capital A and lowercase a. Capital typically represents the dominant genotype allele, and lowercase represents the recessive allele. And the parents both are the AA genotype, and they breed together. What are the possible genotypes of the offspring? And so the way you set up a Punnett square, very simple, and this will likely be review for many of you, is you simply look at the two alleles of the parents. Let's just say this is the mother here. The mother will either pass on the capital A or the lowercase a. And then we'll put the father on the other axis, and they'll pass on either the capital A or the lowercase a. And then you just look at the combos that can be produced. So here, capital from mother, capital from father, and you get the double capital A's. Here you have a lowercase from mother and a capital from father, so that's a combo of the two. Similarly, capital from mother, lowercase from father, and so you get that, and then lowercase from both parents. And so there are various genotypic outcomes, and we can assume that these all happen with equal frequency. There's just as much likelihood of this as there is of this, and of this as there is of that exact combination, assuming that the genes segregate appropriately and there's independent assortment. And so there's a 25% chance of getting any of these. The terminology that we use is when it's the same allele that is passed on from both parents to the offspring. We call that homozygous. And so double capitals is homozygous dominant. This with the capital and the lowercase is heterozygous, meaning hetero meaning different, so it has both forms. And then there's homozygous recessive right there. And so these are just the terms that you'll encounter a lot. Homozygous means it's the same alleles. Heterozygous means it has different copies of the alleles. Now, where this can get a bit more tricky, and this is before we get into dihybrid crosses, which involve passing on multiple alleles at the same time. This can get a bit tricky on questions that ask you about ratios of genotype and phenotype and other things like that. And so let's just assume that we have a normal dominance pattern where if the dominant form is present, then that will be the phenotype expressed. So if they ask you about the likelihood of passing on the different genotypes, it's a 1-to-1 to 1-to-1 ratio. But notice here that we have the same genotype arrived at in two different ways. Here it's the capital A from the mother and the lowercase from the father. Here it's the lowercase a from the mother and the capital from the father. And so what we have here is a 1-to-2 to 1 genotype ratio. So the genotype ratio. And so that's a question that they could ask. What is the ratio of genotypes? And that's purely mathematical. This is as likely as that, this is as likely as that, and so on. But because these are the same, you get 2 chances at the heterozygote, and then you have 1 chance at the homozygous dominant and 1 chance at the homozygous recessive, and that's supposed to be an A there. Now, if they ask you something about the ratio of phenotypes, then you have to know the dominance pattern. And if we assume the typical traditional dominance pattern, where if the dominant allele is present, then it will present with that phenotype, then notice that there are 3 cases where you have the dominant allele present. And only 1 where you have the recessive allele present in a homozygous manner. And with traditional patterns, you need to have homozygous recessive in order to display that recessive phenotype. So let's just simplify this a bit and say that capital A is a red flower petal, and lowercase a is a white petal, and that capital A has the traditional dominance pattern. That means that all 3 of these will be red. So you have red here, there, and there, and this is the only white one. So you have white there. And so now what we see is that the phenotype ratio is going to be 3 to 1 red to white phenotype. And so be careful with questions like this. Even with a simple 1 gene type of question, they can trip you up a bit on looking at the genotype ratios versus the phenotype ratios and things like that. But as long as you understand the basic principles of the Punnett Square, then you're going to be able to handle these questions very easily, and you'll appreciate when you encounter them. Now we'll get into the Dihybrid Cross, and we'll also discuss different dominance patterns that can come up in nature. But understanding how to set up this Punnett Square, how there is independent assortment and there's segregation, so that each parent who has both of these alleles will pass on either this one or that one to their offspring. That's the foundation of this, and then we'll get into some of the more complex manifestations of this principle.